Hey everyone, welcome to Media Matters. I'm Alex, joined as always by my curious co-host Rowan, and today we're diving into something that affects literally every piece of information you consume.
And I have to say, Alex, when you first told me about today's topic, I was pretty stunned. We're talking about how just five companies basically control what billions of people see and hear every day, right?
Exactly, it's pretty wild when you think about it. You know how people often say we're living in the information age? Well, what they don't usually mention is who's controlling all that information.
And this all started back in the 1980s with Reagan and Thatcher.
That's right. It's actually a fascinating story of how we went from having hundreds of independent media voices to this incredible concentration of power. And the really interesting part is how it's affecting everything from our local news to what shows up in our social media feeds.
I've noticed a lot of local newspapers disappearing in recent years. Is that connected to all this?
It absolutely is, and that's just one piece of this puzzle we'll be exploring today. We'll look at how market forces have completely transformed our media landscape, what it means for democracy, and why some people are fighting back against this system.
Sounds like we've got quite a journey ahead of us.
We sure do. Let's dive right in. Let me take you back to a really pivotal moment in media history. It's 1981, and Ronald Reagan has just taken office with a clear mission to transform how media operates in America.
The famous Reagan deregulation era, right? I've heard about this, but I'm curious about what specifically changed for media companies.
So, before Reagan, media companies had to follow what was called the Fairness Doctrine. They were required to present controversial issues in a balanced way and operate in the public interest. But Reagan's FCC chairman, Mark Fowler, had a completely different vision.
Wait, they actually had rules about being fair and balanced? That seems almost unreal compared to today.
I know, Fowler famously said that television was just another appliance, quote, a toaster with pictures, unquote. He believed the market should decide everything, not government regulations.
So, what happened when they started dismantling these rules?
The changes were dramatic. First, they eliminated limits on how many commercial minute stations could run per hour. Then they relaxed ownership restrictions that had prevented companies from owning too many stations in one market.
Hmm. And I'm guessing that's when we started seeing the first big media mergers?
Exactly. And across the Atlantic, Margaret Thatcher was implementing similar policies in Britain. She opened up commercial television licenses and relaxed cross-ownership rules between newspapers and broadcasters.
So, it was like a coordinated shift on both sides of the Atlantic?
Absolutely. And here's something fascinating. By 1983, 90% of US media was controlled by 50 companies. That seemed like a lot of concentration at the time, but looking back now,
Oh, wow. Compared to just five companies today, that almost sounds diverse.
right? And the really interesting part is how quickly things changed. The 1984 Cable Act removed price controls on cable TV, leading to a massive expansion of cable networks. But it also set the stage for cable monopolies in many local markets.
I've always wondered why most areas only have one or two cable providers to choose from.
That's a direct result of these policies. And then in 1987, they officially abolished the Fairness Doctrine. The argument was that with so many new cable channels, we didn't need rules ensuring balanced coverage anymore.
But didn't that just mean that channels could start pushing whatever viewpoint they wanted?
Precisely. And it opened the door for something we take for granted today: openly partisan news coverage. Before this, it would have been unthinkable for a news channel to openly favor one political perspective.
And all this happened without much public debate?
That's one of the most remarkable parts. These changes were mostly presented as technical regulatory adjustments. The public didn't really understand the long-term implications.
It's kind of ironic. The very media outlets that should have been reporting on these changes were the ones benefiting from them.
Exactly, and here's something that really puts it in perspective. In 1982, Warner Communications and American Express formed Warner Amex Cable. That company would eventually evolve into Time Warner, which then merged with AOL and now is part of Warner Bros. Discovery,
So basically, what started as a small cable company merger became.
one of the largest media conglomerates in history, and that's just one example. These early changes created a kind of domino effect that we're still seeing play out today.
It's fascinating how decisions made 40 years ago are still shaping what we see and hear today.
And the really crucial thing to understand is that this wasn't just about business. These changes fundamentally altered how information flows through our society.
It's like they rewrote the rules of how we communicate as a culture.
Exactly. And those new rules would set the stage for even bigger changes in the decades to come. So now let's look at how all those regulatory changes led us to where we are today, with just five companies wielding unprecedented control over global media.
I keep hearing about the big five, but I'd love to understand exactly how big we're talking about here.
Well, let me put it this way. Disney alone brings in more annual revenue than the GDP of many small countries. Just their streaming services reach over 230 million subscribers globally.
That's almost the population of Brazil. And they're just one of the five?
Exactly. Then you've got Warner Brothers Discovery, which now controls everything from HBO to CNN, plus a massive film studio and streaming platform. Comcast owns NBC Universal, Sky, and the largest cable network in America.
And these companies keep getting bigger, right? I mean, just last year we saw some pretty massive deals.
It's like watching giants absorb other giants. Paramount Global, which people might remember as Viacom CBS, now controls CBS, MTV, Nickelodeon, and Paramount Pictures. And then there's Netflix, which started as a DVD rental service and is now producing more content than any traditional studio.
But what does this concentration of ownership actually mean for the content we consume?
That's a crucial question. Think about this. When Disney bought 21st Century Fox, they didn't just get the movie studio. They acquired National Geographic, FX Networks, and a controlling stake in Hulu.
So one company now controls what used to be competing voices?
Precisely. And here's something that might surprise you. These five companies don't just control entertainment. They own news networks, book publishers, movie theaters, theme parks, and even internet service providers.
Wait, so the company that provides my internet might also be creating the content I'm watching?
Yes! And that's where things get really interesting. Comcast, for instance, can control both what content gets made through NBC Universal and how that content reaches you through their cable and internet services.
That sounds like it could create some serious conflicts of interest.
It absolutely does. And there's another layer to this. These companies also own most of the streaming platforms. So even when you think you're cutting the cord, you're still operating within their ecosystem.
I never thought about it that way. We're basically choosing between different channels owned by the same few companies.
And here's something fascinating about market share. In 2024, these five companies accounted for over 70% of all streaming subscriptions worldwide.
70%? That's kind of terrifying when you think about it.
It gets even more interesting when you look at content production. These companies aren't just distributing content, they're increasingly focused on creating their own original programming.
Like all those Netflix and Disney Plus originals?
Exactly. In 2024 alone, Disney spent more than $20 billion on content creation. That's more than the entire film industry spent in 1990.
So they're not just gatekeepers anymore, they're actually creating most of what we watch?
And read and listen to. Remember, these companies also own major book publishers, music labels, and news organizations. It's a level of vertical integration that would have been unthinkable 40 years ago.
I'm starting to understand why this matters so much. It's not just about entertainment, is it?
Not at all. When five companies control this much of our cultural conversation, they have enormous influence over how we understand the world. And that influence keeps growing with each new merger and acquisition.
It's like they've become the architects of our shared cultural experience.
That's a perfect way to put it. And as we'll see next, this concentration of power has some pretty serious implications for democracy and public discourse. Now, while we've been talking about traditional media consolidation, there's another fascinating layer to this story, the rise of digital platforms and how they've completely transformed the media landscape.
You mean like social media and search engines? How do they fit into this picture?
Well, imagine this. Even though we have these five huge traditional media companies, they're all actually competing for attention with digital giants like Meta, Alphabet, and Amazon. And these tech companies have created an entirely new kind of media power.
Right? Because they control how we find and share content, even if they don't create it themselves.
Exactly. And here's something pretty mind-bending. In 2024, about 70% of all news traffic came through these platforms. So even if a traditional media company creates great content, they're completely dependent on these tech platforms for distribution.
So it's like the tech companies have become the new gatekeepers?
Precisely. And they've created something called engagement-based algorithms that decide what content gets seen and what doesn't. These algorithms are designed to keep people scrolling, clicking, and sharing.
I've noticed that sometimes I'll see a really serious news story right next to, well, a video of a cat riding a Roomba.
And that's part of the problem. These algorithms don't distinguish between quality journalism and viral content. They're just looking for what gets the most engagement.
So how has this affected traditional journalism?
Well, many news organizations have had to completely change how they operate. They're now chasing clicks and shares just to survive. Some studies show that newsrooms are producing shorter articles, more sensational headlines, and focusing on topics that generate the most social media engagement.
That can't be good for the quality of journalism.
It's created what some experts call a race to the bottom. And here's something really concerning. Local news has been hit particularly hard. When you're competing for attention globally, stories about your local school board meeting just don't generate the same kind of engagement as viral content.
I've definitely noticed fewer local news stories in my feed. But what about the business side of things?
That's where it gets really interesting. Digital advertising revenue, which used to support journalism, now primarily goes to the tech platforms. In 2024, Alphabet and Meta together captured about 60% of all digital ad spending.
Wait, so they're not just controlling distribution, they're also taking most of the money?
Exactly. And this has created a really difficult situation for news organizations. They need to be on these platforms to reach audiences, but the platforms are also taking most of their potential revenue.
It's like they're caught in a digital catch 22.
And there's another crucial aspect to this. These platforms aren't just passive conduits for information. Their algorithms actively shape what information spreads and what doesn't.
You mean they can actually influence what news we see?
Absolutely. Small changes in their algorithms can dramatically affect which stories reach large audiences. And unlike traditional media, they're not subject to the same kind of oversight or transparency requirements.
So we've gone from five big media companies to, what, an even more concentrated system?
In many ways, yes. While we still have those five major traditional media companies, we now have this additional layer of platform control that's arguably even more powerful. And these platforms are increasingly moving into content creation themselves.
Like Amazon Prime Video and Apple TV Plus?
Exactly. The lines between content creators, distributors, and platforms are becoming increasingly blurred. And this convergence is creating new challenges for competition, diversity of voices, and the future of journalism itself.
It's like we're watching the next chapter of media consolidation happening in real time.
And the really crucial thing to understand is that this isn't just about business models or technology. It's about who controls the flow of information in our society and ultimately how we understand the world around us. You know, while we're talking about these massive changes in media, there's a critical story happening right in our own backyards that really brings this all home. The devastating decline of local news.
I've noticed this personally. The paper I grew up reading just closed last year after serving our community for over 80 years.
Sadly, that's becoming incredibly common. Since 2005, more than 2,500 local newspapers have shut down in America alone. We're talking about papers that covered school boards, city councils, local elections.
That's more than two newspapers every week for 20 years. But surely some digital news sites are filling that gap?
Unfortunately not. Let me paint a picture of what we call news deserts. These are communities where there's literally no local news coverage at all. As of 2024, more than 200 counties in the U.S. have zero local news outlets.
Zero. So who's watching local government in these places?
That's exactly the problem. Studies show that in areas without local news coverage, government spending actually increases while voter turnout decreases. It's like turning off the lights and hoping everyone behaves.
And I'm guessing corruption becomes more likely too?
Absolutely. There's this fascinating case from 2023 in a small Midwest town. After their local paper closed, the city council approved a $20 million development project with virtually no public scrutiny. Turns out, several council members had undisclosed financial interests in the project.
Wow. And nobody was there to investigate or report on it?
Nobody. And here's something that might surprise you. When local newspapers disappear, it even affects municipal bonds. Cities actually have to pay higher interest rates because there's less transparency and oversight.
So taxpayers literally pay more when there's no local news coverage?
Exactly. And it gets worse. Remember those five major media companies we discussed? Many of them have been buying up local papers and TV stations, then centralizing operations to cut costs.
Oh, right, I've seen this. Isn't that why so many local TV stations run the exact same stories?
Yes, in 2024, one media group owned over 200 local TV stations and would regularly send out identical scripts to all of them. Local anchors would read the same exact words in hundreds of different cities.
That's pretty creepy when you think about it. What happened to actual local reporting?
Well, here's a stark statistic. The number of newspaper reporters has fallen by 60% since 2000. That's thousands of experienced journalists who used to cover local courts, schools, and government just gone.
But what about online local news sites? Couldn't they step in?
Some are trying, but here's the challenge. Running a good newsroom is expensive. You need experienced reporters, editors, fact-checkers, and online advertising just doesn't generate enough revenue to support that kind of operation in most local markets.
So we're losing the watchdogs of local democracy?
That's exactly what's happening. And there's another concerning trend. Studies show that areas without local news sources tend to become more politically polarized. People rely more on national news outlets, which often focus on divisive issues rather than local concerns.
I've noticed that in my own community. We spend more time arguing about national politics than discussing local issues that actually affect our daily lives.
And that's what makes this crisis so insidious. When we lose local news, we don't just lose information. We lose the shared stories and experiences that help bind communities together.
Is anyone trying to solve this problem?
There are some interesting experiments happening. Some communities are developing nonprofit news models. Others are trying reader-supported cooperatives. But the scale of the crisis is massive compared to these efforts.
It's like we're watching the slow motion disappearance of an entire layer of our democracy.
And that's really what's at stake here. Local news isn't just about crime reports and high school sports scores at Ipsos. It's about having informed, engaged communities where people understand what's happening around them and can make educated decisions about their local government. With everything we've discussed about media consolidation and the crisis in local news, you might be wondering, what's being done about it? Well, there's actually a fascinating battle happening right now over the future of media.
I've heard about some antitrust efforts, but are they really making any progress?
That's one of the most interesting developments. In 2024, we saw the first serious attempts to break up some of these media conglomerates since the 1970s. The Department of Justice has started looking at vertical integration in streaming services.
You mean how companies own both the content and the platforms we use to watch it?
Exactly. And there's this remarkable grassroots movement called Project 2025 that's pushing for something called structural separation. They want to prevent companies from owning both content creation and distribution networks.
So, like stopping Comcast from owning both NBC and internet services?
Precisely. But here's where it gets really interesting. We're also seeing the rise of what some people call decentralized media. These are platforms owned and operated by their users rather than big corporations.
I've heard about some of these. Aren't they using blockchain technology or something?
Some are, but there's also this amazing movement of citizen journalism platforms. Regular people are creating local news cooperatives where subscribers actually own shares in the organization.
That's pretty innovative. Are they actually succeeding, though?
Well, in Burlington, Vermont, there's this incredible example. Their local paper was bought by a big chain and gutted. But the community came together and created a reader-owned digital news service that now has more subscribers than the original paper ever did.
So communities are fighting back against the Big Five?
And they're getting creative about it. There's this fascinating project in Seattle where they're using artificial intelligence to help small newsrooms automate basic reporting tasks, freeing up journalists to do more investigative work.
But won't AI just make it easier for big companies to replace journalists?
That's the big debate right now, but here's something surprising. Some smaller outlets are actually using AI more effectively than the giants. They're combining technology with local knowledge in ways the big companies just can't match.
I guess they're more nimble, less bureaucratic.
Exactly. And there's another crucial development. Young people are increasingly rejecting traditional media models entirely. They're building their own news networks through social media, newsletters, and podcasts.
Like what we're doing right now?
You got it. And these independent creators are starting to band together. There's this new network of independent journalists who share resources and collaborate on big stories, kind of like a 21st century wire service.
But can these smaller operations really compete with the massive budgets of the Big Five?
That's where regulation comes in. There's growing support for something called the Local Journalism Preservation Act, which would create tax incentives for supporting independent news operations.
So the government might actually help break up these media monopolies?
It's possible. And here's something really encouraging. We're seeing successful antitrust actions in Europe that could provide a blueprint for similar efforts here. The European Union just forced one of the major streaming platforms to spin off its production studio.
Sounds like there's actually some hope for more diverse media ownership.
There is, but it's going to take sustained effort. The big media companies aren't going to give up their power easily. They spent over $300 million on lobbying just last year.
300 million? That's more than some entire news organization's budgets.
And that's exactly why this battle matters so much. It's not just about who owns what. It's about whether we'll have a media system that serves democracy or one that serves corporate interests.
It's kind of amazing to think that the future of media might be more about these small, innovative projects than the big corporations.
That's what makes this moment so exciting. We're not just watching the transformation of media, Sat. We're watching communities take back control of their own stories. You know, when we started this journey today, we were looking at how just 5 companies came to dominate global media. But what we've uncovered is really a story about power, democracy, and who gets to shape our understanding of the world.
It's pretty eye-opening when you connect all the dots from those early deregulation decisions in the 1980s all the way to today's digital platforms.
And what's fascinating is how this isn't just about business or technology. Every time a local newspaper closes or a media merger happens, it affects how communities understand themselves and make decisions.
I keep thinking about those news deserts you mentioned 200 counties with zero local coverage. That's going to have consequences we can't even fully grasp yet.
But you know what gives me hope? All these innovative responses we're seeing, from community-owned news cooperatives to independent journalist networks, people aren't just accepting this situation.
Right. It's like the bigger these media giants get, the more determined some communities become to create alternatives.
Exactly, and that's really the key message here. The future of media isn't set in stone. It's going to be determined by the choices we make as citizens and consumers.
So, what we choose to read, watch, and support really matters.
More than ever. In the end, the most powerful force in media isn't technology or money, it's attention. And that's something each of us controls every single day.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to share it with your friends. See you next time.